A few days before my 44th birthday, in May of last year, 62% of the citizens of this country placed a mark on their ballot paper, which was to have a profound and immediate impact on my life, the lives of thousands of other lesbian, gay, bisexual and transgender people all across Ireland, and perhaps millions of others globally. In the days that followed, as the euphoria died down, I can remember vividly walking down Grafton Street and everybody was bustling about their everyday business. And I felt like I was walking on air. And the refrain in my mind just kept on saying, wow, this is what it feels like to be equal. For that referendum question was about much more than the right to marry. Any LGBT person that I know interpreted the referendum as an affirmation of their validity and their status as an equal citizen.
I have quite a powerful carrying voice. But the message from this small independent republic to the entire world is one of dignity and freedom and tolerance, liberté, fraternité, égalité.
I don't know what the people who were caught on camera crying were feeling that day. I can guess that they were feeling a mixture of sheer joy and elation. But I'd also hazard the guess that they were feeling sheer relief that the struggle for equality in law was over. Perhaps some of them had carried that struggle all of their lives. I know that was my sense that day as I walked down Grafton Street, that no longer did I ever have to do another interview where I had to argue for the case for my right to marry the person that I loved, or that I had to argue that my family was as equal under the eyes of the Constitution as that of my siblings. So the struggle for legal equality was over, but where had it begun? And I can only talk, I suppose, from my own perspective. My own, I suppose, experience with struggle started when I was born, 1971, the youngest of 5 children. And at the time, I suppose, 1971, it was a very different Ireland. And the expectation was that you'd grow up, you'd get married, you'd have loads of children, and you'd stay married until you died. And unfortunately, in my case, my parents' marriage was already in stormy waters. My mother struggled on for a further 7 years, and it became just too difficult. And she took us 5 children and herself back to our hometown of Mullingar, where we started afresh. And to say that the life of that 35-year-old woman raising 5 children on her own was a struggle is an understatement. Everything was difficult. You know, even down to getting qualified for what was called at the time the Deserted Wives Allowance, an awful title, but a wonderful lifeline for our family. But I remember, I suppose, the overriding sense of struggle for me from that experience was the sense of stigma and shame of coming from what was called a broken home, or the fear of being caught out in a lie around the story that I spun around the fact that, I'd say, oh, my father he works away from home. It was, I suppose, a struggle or an experience that was to be formative and constant in my life. The dominant force at the time in Irish society was the Catholic Church. This is a picture of the Cathedral of Christ the King in Mullingar. And long before the days of bypasses and motorways, as you approached Mullingar, particularly from the Dublin side, you'd see the Cathedral of Christ the King looming in the background in the horizon. And for me, this symbolised more than a fine architectural building of its time. It symbolised for me the tight hold that the Catholic Church had on Irish social mores. At times, I found that hold suffocating. The year I did my inter-certificate, Ireland had its first divorce referendum. And it was a brave move by the then Fine Gael-led government of Garret FitzGerald. But when I look back now, it was even braver by the people who led the ground campaign for that referendum. And one of those people was my mother. She was the treasurer of the Mullingar Divorce Action Group. And as a teenager, I remember arguing with my peers in religion class and school, arguing for the right for people to have the right to remarry. And I've often thought that 30 years later, here I was arguing for my right to remarry. Perhaps it wasn't a coincidence. But that divorce referendum, unfortunately, at that time failed, and it failed badly. It failed by 25%. And I can still remember the sting of that failure. I remember it not necessarily the disappointment for myself, because I was 15. I remember it for my mother, for my family. I interpreted it as a rejection by society of families like mine. Families like mine weren't to be encouraged. And you might think, oh, that's very dramatic, very teenage angst stuff. But really, was it? Only 2 years previous, a young girl by the name of Anne Lovett had died on her own in a grotto in Granard with her newborn baby because she had to conceal her pregnancy. It was the same year that the Kerry Babies Tribunal investigated 2 infant deaths that were also concealed. Social oppression at the time in Ireland was very strong, and for anybody who lived outside of those tight societal expectations, life was difficult. There were no LGBT role models growing up when I was in Mullingar, so there was nobody really to kind of look to support or to gain support from. Very few LGBT people were out or put their heads above the parapet. A few notable people did. This woman, Joni Crone, appeared in 1980 on The Late Late Show, and she was interviewed by Gay Byrne. What was the focus of the interview? Being a lesbian in Ireland. Such was the unusualness or the lack of commonality of that existence at that time that it warranted a full interview. That was brave. It was around this time that the gay rights movement began in Ireland. And it began, I suppose, in many ways out of the death of a young man called Declan Flynn, who was murdered homophobically in Fairview Park in Dublin. And his assailants got suspended sentences, so they walked free. And it was out of, I suppose, the fact that he had died so violently and the seemingly lack of value of a young gay life, and coupled with a global movement for gay rights, that the first Gay Pride March happened in Dublin. And this is an image from that. So you can see how, it has grown exponentially since then. There were other trailblazers along the way. People like Senator David Norris, who we saw in the clip earlier. He took a case against the state for criminalising him as a homosexual man. It wasn't to be for at least a decade later before those archaic Victorian laws were repealed. So in 1993, after I had celebrated my 21st birthday, it was still illegal to be a practicing homosexual. Now, there's a few things about that statement is, homosexuality is not like a sport. You don't practice it and become better at it. You just are. But it was the fact that it was criminal to practice homosexuality. Also the fact that women were exempt from those laws. So 2 men could be arrested for having sex, but 2 women could do whatever they wanted, relatively speaking, of course. But seriously, that invisibility of women that legislation spoke volumes for the invisibility of women. So for somebody like me, it was very hard to vision how I might live a full and authentic life as an out lesbian when we were totally invisible. And it was also around this time that an organisation called GLEN, the Gay and Lesbian Equality Network, was formed. And one of the first key tasks that that organisation set about doing was decriminalisation, which I said happened in 1993. And those organisations are still working today on equality issues, still challenging, still struggling. For my own part, I came out as a lesbian in the mid-90s, and I joined the organisation as a full-time staff member in 2006, having completed a postgraduate master's in equality studies. And I was to work for the best part of the next decade with Glenn, working on various LGBT equality issues, including the marriage referendum. There are few people who have the privilege of working on issues that intimately impact their lives. I'm one of them. I count myself as one of those lucky ones. And it was also in around 2006 that the Labour Party were in opposition, and they introduced a civil unions bill. And this was a really significant step, because it was the first time that we were talking about civil unions which were almost like marriage. And for an organisation like GLEN, we had to make a very difficult call. Do we support this progress or do we hold out? And we chose to support the bill. And so began a pretty bitter internal struggle within the LGBT community. And it was akin to the civil war of the LGBT community. On the one hand, you had people who said, yes, this is significant progress, let's welcome it, and let's bank those, those gains. And on the other hand, you said no, people who said, no, this will delay things, way down the line, we should hold out. So Glenn welcomed it, and as I say, it was a difficult time. It was a struggle within the LGBT community. And I suppose for my own part, it wasn't a difficult decision for me. I didn't feel it was within our gift to reject vital protections that were needed and necessary by people who didn't have time to wait. Another change of government, Fianna Fáil and the Green Party, they introduced a civil partnership bill that was eventually passed. My partner and I had a fabulous day in April 2011, surrounded by family and friends. We already had a son, and our daughter was born a couple of weeks later. And I suppose the reality of the protections and how vital those protections were came home with a bang 18 months later when I was diagnosed with breast cancer. And treatment was complicated. I became even more ill during treatment. I had a very long, protracted hospital stay, 2 ICU admissions, a night when I thought I wouldn't see the dawn. And I remember vividly that night thinking, at least Marion won't have a legal mess to deal with if I die. Thankfully, I didn't, obviously. As the pendulum of life swings, my health came back to fullness, and I was ready and there, I suppose, to join in the last stages of the marriage referendum campaign. I suppose at that stage, another change of government. We had then the Labour and Fine Gael were in government together, and a real possibility for a referendum came on the table. Constitutional referendum was hugely supportive of holding a referendum, and the date was set. The civil war that I spoke about earlier was put to one side, or at least on ice, and groups came together to fight the struggle together. There were lots of struggles within the bigger struggle. Money was a big issue. We didn't have any. Even when we did get funds to put up posters, our yes posters were outnumbered by 5 to 1 by the no posters. But what we did was we tried to create people as human posters. So my job in the national campaign was to support and coordinate the local yes equality groups that were made up of thousands and thousands of individuals, gay and straight, who would come home from a hard day's work, get something to eat, get out again, start knocking on doors in their local areas and making the case for why they were going to vote yes. And sometimes that was a real struggle for people. We actually had to organise group counselling sessions in large urban areas. Such was the difficulty or the abuse that some of our canvassers faced. There was also, I suppose, we knew that we wouldn't win undecided voters over to a yes vote if we were angrily demanding our rights. What we did was we appealed to the fairness and the values of Irishness, the fact that Irish people were fundamentally, intrinsically fair and equal and just people. And we used those kind of messages to, I suppose, bring people into a conversation, a national conversation about what kind of Ireland we wanted to create for future generations. Because this, on the face of it, was an issue, a minority issue. And we had to, the challenge or the struggle was to make it into a national campaign that would have resonance and relevance for all of the population. So we invited people, as I say, into that conversation. We got grannies involved and mammies involved, and this is mine. We got hurlers and rugby players and ex-presidents and even Mrs. Brown. So at this stage we knew that the tide was with us. We knew that, you know, that we had a huge amount of momentum and support, but there were still challenges. The challenge, of course, to get people out to vote was a very, very significant one. We knew that a lot of our support was in the younger populations, and traditionally they don't vote in their numbers. We brought it back to ordinary people like myself. This was what the referendum was about. And we asked people to think of the people that they knew that this would impact on. And social media, there was dynamic and creative and just wonderful social media campaigns, sometimes led by the students' unions groups who did massive amounts of work nationally. And this image over here is of students queuing up to register to vote. Who knew? Like images like this, I remember images of people queuing in South Africa to vote in post-apartheid South Africa. You know, never before would you see groups of students queuing, and that in itself created a momentum. But also there was wonderful initiatives from overseas, people who couldn't make it home to vote, but who asked by images like this, pleaded with people, please vote for me, I can't. And then, of course, there was the amazing Home to Vote campaign where people from all over the world came home in their droves, gay and straight, to cast their vote because they wanted to stake a claim in creating a better and fairer, more softer Ireland. That day in May 2015 was a wonderful day. A day, the wonder of which will probably last a lifetime. It was a proud day to be Irish. As a mother, it was a very proud day for me when I was able to look my children in the eye and say to them, yes, we are equal. Thank you.